Okay, let's move on to 1963. I've got 3 slides summarizing 1963 before we get into details. The first slide is 1963 Endgame, Cuba. So I say here JFK and the hardline members of the national security establishment continued to grow ever further apart throughout 1963, as this series of slides demonstrates. Mongoose became moribund on October 26, 1962, when its activities were suspended. And at the end of October 62, ExComm ordered cancellation of all sabotage or militant operations during negotiations with the Soviets over the details of withdrawal of their offensive weapons from Cuba. Early in 1963, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy declared, quote, "There is well-nigh universal agreement that Mongoose is at a dead end," end quote. Meanwhile, Cuba planning in the Pentagon lurched into territory previously forbidden by President Kennedy. As JFK's ad hoc committee, the ICCCA, struggled to define a new Cuba policy throughout most of the year, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the Pentagon, Maxwell Taylor, who had assumed his post on October 1st, 1962, just prior to the missile crisis, blithely proceeded to do his own thing with regard to Cuba, without waiting for the bureaucratic machinery to crank out a new policy. In a striking display of insubordination, Maxwell Taylor, in the spring of '63, proceeded to secretly plan for, first, a Northwoods-style engineered set of pretexts to invade Cuba. Now, this was in spite of JFK's failure to endorse Northwoods in March of '62, and in spite of the president's refusal to invade Cuba in either April or October of that year. And with Taylor's encouragement, Cinq-Gallant Admiral Dennison developed Op Plan 380-63, a detailed contingency plan with dates attached for commencing a full package of massive airstrikes against Cuba on July 26, 1964. That's Cuba's Independence Day. Isn't that nice? To be followed by a U.S. invasion about August 3rd, 1964, with the planned overthrow of Castro's government and the defeat of Cuba occurring, optimistically, by October 1st, '64, just in time for the U.S. presidential election. Now, this was forwarded to Taylor for consideration in a memo from the Joint Staff on May the 1st. May the 1st, '63. They forwarded him the Admiral Dennison war plan for attacking Cuba the following year. This outrageous plan was finally withdrawn from consideration on October 4th, 1963, when Vietnam was the new star on the horizon. That's the last page in the set of documents, withdrawn from consideration October 4th, 1963, without any explanation given, but we know the reason. Vietnam was the only game in town at that point for the Joint Chiefs and the Hawks in the national security state. Now, I've got another 1963 endgame slide, Vietnam. And JFK found himself at increasing odds with the Pentagon and civilian hawks in the State Department over Vietnam policy. Now, you'll recall that 1962, according to John Newman, was called the optimistic interlude, when McNamara and JFK were lied to all year long about the supposed success of South Vietnam's war against the North and the supposed success of the advisory effort, even though neither one was going very well. But by March of '63, John Newman has written, he thinks JFK and McNamara had figured out that they'd been lied to for the whole previous year. Meanwhile, in April '62, JFK ally, Ambassador John Kenneth Galbraith, ambassador to India, had begun to seriously question why the U.S. was in Vietnam at all. And he got JFK's attention. As a result, he urged his staff back in '62 to be prepared to seize upon any favorable moment to reduce our commitment. And the following month, on May 8th of '62, McNamara had directed General Paul Harkins, MacV, to devise a plan for turning full responsibility for the war over to South Vietnam and reducing the size of our command. I'm sure Harkins was shocked to hear that back in May of '62, but that's what he was told. Now, moving ahead to '63, on April 18th, McNamara first made mention in a meeting that we know of a 1,000-man American troop withdrawal from South Vietnam by the end of the year. And that was on April 18th. On May the 6th, at the 8th SecDef Conference on Vietnam, McNamara ordered concrete plans for a 1,000-man withdrawal of U.S. advisors by the end of the year, and told Harkins that his withdrawal plans, as presented to McNamara at the conference, were too slow and needed to be accelerated so as to have all U.S. troops out by the end of '65. So, recapitulating here, McNamara told Harkins in May of '62 to begin a withdrawal plan, and it would advise turning over full responsibility of the war to South Vietnam. He got a full-scale report on this a year later in May '63 and said, oh no, this is too slow, it needs to be accelerated, and I want concrete plans for a 1,000-man withdrawal by the end of the year. So there are ominous hints throughout the year that things are beginning to fall apart in Vietnam. Not only that the war is not going that well for the South Vietnamese and that the strength of the Viet Cong is growing, but President Diem is cracking down way too hard on the Buddhists, and Diem and his Catholic supporters are in a minority, and the Buddhists are in a majority. He's cracking down on these people, on their freedom of religion and their free speech. So things are not going well in South Vietnam. Buddhist monks are burning themselves to death in the streets, getting a lot of worldwide attention, and people in the U.S. government are beginning to talk about a coup, getting rid of Diem. So Kennedy's concerned. He sends Robert McNamara and Maxwell Taylor, Secretary of Defense and chairman of the JCS, over to Vietnam in September to do one more trip, one more examination, and produce one more report. They return on October 2nd and turn over a report which recommends what Kennedy wanted: a 1,000-man withdrawal of U.S. advisors by the end of the year, and full withdrawal by the end of 1965. That's what's in the report. It required considerable arm twisting on his part to get them to add the 1,000-man withdrawal by the end of the year back into the report. They had taken it out because of a revolt by all the hawks on the study group that went on the trip. Some of the military hawks and a lot of the civilians said, we can't put that in the report. We don't think anybody should be withdrawn. So Kennedy had to force them to put that back in. And as this was presented to the public by Pierre Salinger and by McNamara, this withdrawal of 1,000 men by the end of the year and by all troops by the end of '65 was predicated to the public on the fiction of battlefield success. So Kennedy, in a jujitsu move, was turning this lie of battlefield success, turning it against these liars and conspirators to justify pulling out. On October 11th, a very important document was promulgated, NSAM 263, National Security Action Memo 263, which was top secret, signed by McGeorge Bundy, and it ordered implementation of the recommendations in the McNamara-Taylor report to withdraw 1,000 troops by the end of the year, 1,000 of the 16,000 plus advisors by the end of the year, and to complete U.S. withdrawal of its advisory forces by the end of '65. The NSAM also ordered that Diem not be informed. So this was not done to use as leverage against him to make him do reforms. That's what some people have alleged. This was Kennedy making a firm decision to implement these recommendations. He made sure McNamara and Taylor made the recommendations to him. He's just approving their recommendations, and he's not even signing it. He's having McGeorge Bundy sign it, but he's implemented those recommendations. He got what he wanted out of their trip. Now he's ordered that it be done, regardless of how bad things in the country were going. At the next SecDef conference on November 20th, McNamara was told the truth about how bad the war and the U.S. advisory effort were going for the first time. For the first time, 2 days prior to JFK's assassination. As John Newman says, the clear implication here is that those briefing McNamara, read between the lines, Maxwell Taylor, knew that President Kennedy would not survive his trip to Dallas and were preparing McNamara for the ensuing and immediate escalation of the U.S. Vietnam effort into a combat role following JFK's death. And that escalation in policy and change in policy was carried on throughout the whole month of December. So here's Kennedy meeting with Taylor and McNamara on October 2nd, after their return from Vietnam. He ensured with some difficulty that their report following their trip recommended a 1,000-man withdrawal of U.S. forces by the end of the year and a complete pullout by the end of '65. So this is my last slide, featuring Max Taylor, all by himself. He's the man who secretly gutted the Vietnam 1,000-man withdrawal plan in the fall of '63, and hid Op Plan 64, '63 from JFK as it was being developed. Starting in May, he hid it from President Kennedy. That developed into Op Plan 34A. And Op Plan 34A was United States covert activities directly against North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. So Op Plan 34A in 1964 led to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident led to the carte blanche from Congress that gave LBJ authority to go to war in Vietnam. So they've got this thing cooked up. His allies in the Pentagon, along with Max Taylor, starting in May '63, or even earlier than that, and they're hiding it from President Kennedy. And he also hides the fact that he gutted the Vietnam 1,000-man withdrawal so that it wasn't entire units, which is what Kennedy and McNamara wanted. It was just individuals being replaced here and there. And he was still generating plans, as I've said, to invade Cuba in the spring of '63, based on pretexts. I write about that in volume 5 of my book. His performance on both counts during 1963 was a disgraceful example of insubordination and Machiavellian plotting, worthy of Shakespeare's character Iago in Othello. And by the way, Pentagon hawk Paul Nitze supported Taylor's continued call for pretext to invade Cuba during the spring. And this same man had also supported capturing a Soviet ship with missiles on it and taking it to the United States during the missile crisis. That might have provoked a war. And promoted conducting a first strike against the Soviet Union during the missile crisis. He admitted that himself to the authors of the book DEFCON 2. So my third 1963 slide is called Endgame, Ending the Cold War. There's some great books here. To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace by Jeffrey Sachs, 2 Days in June by Andrew Cohen, and JFK and the Unspeakable by Jim Douglas. JFK's peace speech, his commencement address at American University on June the 10th, was a watershed in Cold War relations. In it, he proposed that Americans reevaluate their attitudes toward the Soviet Union. No one had ever done this before, certainly no president. He proposed ending the Cold War instead of winning it. No one had ever done that before. And he proposed a limited nuclear test ban treaty with the USSR after announcing a self-imposed moratorium on US nuclear testing. Now, the limited test ban treaty was initialed in Moscow on July 25th, 63. JFK gave a major speech in support of it the next night on July 26th. It was signed by Great Britain, the USSR, and the US on August 5th, and JFK moved it skillfully through Senate ratification on September 24th, 1963, with an 80-19 overwhelming vote in favor, the veto-proof vote. President Kennedy signed the instruments of ratification in a major signing ceremony on October 7th, 1963. The Joint Chiefs hated the treaty, but JFK had outmaneuvered them. On September 12, 63, Kennedy received another nuclear war briefing from the Net Evaluation Subcommittee of the National Security Council. This one recommended a possible first strike on the USSR in 1968, in which Soviet casualties would be at least 140 million people. This time, instead of walking out of the meeting, as he had in 61, JFK went toe-to-toe with the briefer, concluding, "Preemption is not possible for us. This argues in favor of a conventional force rather than nuclear weapons." On September 20th, 1963, at the United Nations, JFK proposed ending the space race with the Soviet Union and instead going to the moon together as a cooperative goal. I was very skeptical when I first heard about this. I first heard about this in the JFK movie, and then I began to look it up, and I was very skeptical. But I soon concluded that it was true. First of all, he did say that in a speech. There was no ambiguity about it whatsoever. And then on November 12th, I've seen the INSAM document he generated. On November 12th, JFK personally signed INSAM 271. As I said, it's unusual for presidents to personally sign INSAMs. And when they do, it gives them extra emphasis. This document directed NASA head James Webb to take the lead on broader cooperation with the USSR in outer space, including lunar landing programs, and ordering an interim report by December 15th. JFK hadn't gotten any positive response or action from within the bureaucracy, so he made it a national security issue and issued a directive in SAM 271. He was willing to abandon the space race, his most popular program by far, to facilitate détente with the Soviet Union, and considered, facilitating détente. He considered facilitating détente to be in the interest of national security, of course, and therefore altering the space program from a competitive one to a cooperative one was in the interest of national security, as he saw it. Now, in September of '63, many of you will have heard about this, JFK angered the CIA and no doubt the Cold Warriors in the Pentagon by beginning an effort toward a rapprochement with Castro through indirect approaches by Ambassador William Atwood, a long trusted friend of JFK's from prep school at Choate, and Lisa Howard of ABC News. This was furthered by an interview JFK gave to French journalist Jean Daniel, who was knowingly being used as an indirect emissary to Castro, in which the president made clear that as long as Castro eliminated his military ties with the Soviet Union, anything was possible. JFK reiterated that position in a speech in Miami on November 18, '63. Now, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson and State Department official Averell Harriman both supported this rapprochement. But can you just imagine what the hawks in the State Department who learned about it and what the military establishment, the leadership in the Pentagon, and the leadership in the CIA thought about it? I'm sure they were appalled, to say the least, probably up in arms, extremely agitated. Now, listen to this carefully, please. While none of these actions by themselves, neither the peace speech, nor attempts to end the space race, nor the rapprochement with Castro, was the genesis of the assassination plot, I view them as the final nails in JFK's coffin. Proof to the conspirators that JFK really had to go. So I'm still saying that I believe the assassination plot was born immediately after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that these developments in 1963 would have only confirmed their own resolve that they were doing the right thing, that JFK had to go. So here's just one slide about the Cuban policy that was being reformulated in 63. At least that was the intention. Unfortunately, it was the same old solution, invasion, dressed up in new clothing. As I say at the bottom of the slide, it was like putting lipstick on a pig. It didn't make the pig look any better, and it still looked like a pig. Now, the name of this ad hoc committee was the Interdepartmental Coordinating Committee on Cuban Affairs. That's a real mouthful. It's a lot easier to say ICCCA. It began meeting in January, and it was chaired by Sterling Cottrell, who was not a hawk. Now, Cottrell still wanted to overthrow the Castro regime, but he did not favor a U.S. invasion of Cuba in the absence of aggression that threatened the peace in the Western Hemisphere. So state favored the same tired old methods that had not worked previously with mongoose, namely diplomatic, economic, psychological, and warfare and covert actions. This committee met all year long and churned out numerous drafts. The semifinal drafts came out in September and October. And the final document was not formalized until after Kennedy's death on December 30th, 63. It was prepared jointly by State, Defense, and the CIA, and it was titled Contingency Plan for a Coup in Cuba. I write about this in volume 5 of my book, Inside the ARRB. By this time, it was clear the Pentagon had been victorious in the long battles in committee that year with the State Department, and had managed to mold a policy document that hypocritically denied up front that the U.S. contemplated either a premeditated full-scale invasion of Cuba or the contrivance of a provocation, which would be used as a pretext for such action, thus lending a fig leaf of support in the opening statement to JFK's informal no invasion pledge that helped end the missile crisis, which was made by Dean Rusk through the newspapers. However, where the rubber met the road, the policy document went on to say in the very next paragraph that once a coup, which would be a military coup sponsored by the US, once a coup began, a special team of US experts would be inserted into Cuba to evaluate the coup's chances of success. And their goal, believe it or not, would be to report within 24 hours. That's a joke. That makes it clear that they're going to report a predetermined conclusion. Meanwhile, this plan says that the U.S. would reestablish its blockade of Cuba and would prepare to activate Op Plans 312 and 316, the same airstrike and invasion plans considered during the missile crisis. The U.S. special team was to coordinate with coup leaders and get them to publicly proclaim a provisional government and ask for U.S. and OAS assistance, after which, here it comes, the U.S. president would be required to approve activation of Op Plans 312 or 316, which would launch a full-scale invasion of Cuba. This is why I say it's the same old solution dressed up in new clothing. It was putting lipstick on a pig. And by the time this was signed out at the end of December 63, Vietnam was the new star on the horizon, not Cuba. So here's a famous picture of the peace speech, which we've all seen before. It was the most remarkable speech of his presidency. I would say the second most remarkable speech was the one on race relations the very next day on June 11th. So I don't ignore that when I read about John Kennedy. It's just that that's not the subject of this presentation. The subject of this presentation is JFK's war with the national security establishment. So I focus on national security issues. And I do believe that as important as the race relations speech was on June 11th, and important as the Civil Rights Bill was that Kennedy introduced later in June, I believe that this speech, the peace speech, was the most important one he ever gave. So let's focus on that. Jeffrey Sachs wrote a fantastic book about this. He's our foremost, I think, American liberal humanitarian in regard to helping the rest of the world. He's a real philosopher. And he wrote that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the catharsis and turning point for JFK. From then until the end of his life, a year later, Kennedy led. He became a master of events, not their pawn. He envisaged a pathway to peace and achieved it. He was a changed man, and he changed the world. He was both idealist and realist, visionary and arm-twisting politician, end quote. So its primary drafter was Ted Sorensen, JFK's alter ego, with help from McGeorge Bundy and Carl Kazin. Carl Kazin was the number 2 guy on the National Security Council, who had replaced Rostow in that role and who was a nuclear weapons expert. And William Foster, the head of the U.S. Disarmament Agency, the new agency Kennedy had created, and Foster was the head of that agency. Circulation was closely held on the draft speech. McNamara and Rusk saw it with less than a week to go before its delivery. Listen to this. Maxwell Taylor and AEC Chairman Glenn Seaborg were only shown sections of the speech dealing with the proposed nuclear test ban treaty, with only a few days to go. They were not shown the parts about having a new attitude about the Russians or about ending the Cold War. They were just shown the parts about the nuclear test ban treaty. Max Taylor told Carl Kazin that it would not be a good idea to show any parts of the speech to the other chiefs, because their comments would be predictable and nothing good would come of that. That's an understatement. So JFK was about to deliver a hammer blow to the Cold War paradigm in an overt attempt to end the Cold War. He was doing all he could to avoid telegraphing his intentions to his many opponents in the national security establishment. His strategy was to get the public to recognize and understand that there was humanity, decency, and valor on both sides of the Cold War divide, as Jeffrey Sachs expressed it in his book. If he could do that, it would make a test ban treaty acceptable to the public and would help reduce tensions between the superpowers. Listen to this. As the speech began, Kennedy went after Curtis LeMay. This is important enough that I want to read you the background. LeMay was fond of discussing how Roman military might had produced Pax Romana, how the superlative and lethal British Navy in the 18th and 19th centuries had produced Pax Britannica, and with stunning hubris, how his own nuclear bombers in the 1950s had achieved Pax Atomica, and were continuing Pax Atomica into the 1960s. Once during a lecture, LeMay had actually morphed Pax Atomica into Pax Americana. He was claiming full credit for this Pax Americana. JFK began his speech by countering Curtis LeMay's bellicose claim that SAC, his nuclear bomber force, had created Pax Americana based on military might alone. So here's JFK on a very hot day, June 10th, 1963, delivering this watershed speech about the Cold War. And I'll just read you part of the quote in which he's combating Curtis LeMay. He says, "What kind of a peace do I mean? What kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. I'm talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women." He next explained why he was talking about peace, because total war made no sense in the nuclear age. You can read this paragraph later, but that's the new face of war he's talking about. Total war doesn't make sense anymore. And in the final paragraph on this slide, he discusses public attitudes toward peace. He says, Too many people think peace is impossible. They think it's unreal, and they think that war is inevitable and that mankind is doomed. And he says, this belief that war is inevitable and that mankind is doomed is a dangerous defeatist belief. He says, our problems are man-made, therefore they can be resolved by man. Next came the most challenging part of his speech, his attempt to get Americans to stop demonizing the Soviets. Yes, they were our adversaries, but we weren't at war, so therefore they were not our enemies. That was the first thing he was trying to do. This was essential if he were to begin to end the Cold War. So he says, let us re-examine our attitudes toward the Soviet Union. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. That was the Dean Acheson-Paul Nitze argument in NSC 68, the argument of all the hawks during the 1950s and in the early 60s. He says, no, let's re-examine this attitude. He says, in the middle paragraph, he says, nobody suffered more than the Soviet Union during the Second World War. They had at least 20 million people killed. Actually, we think now it's about 27 million. And he says a third of their territory was destroyed and 2/3 of their industrial base was destroyed. A loss equivalent to the devastation of this country east of Chicago in terms of both territory and population and industrial base. That was the equivalency. He's trying to get people to put themselves in the shoes of Soviet citizens and leaders. So he says, today, should war ever break out again, the people in the most danger are the Americans and the Russians. We've got all the weapons, they're aimed at each other, and we're in the most danger of devastation. So our weapons aren't doing much for us. They're actually keeping us in danger. So he concludes his speech by saying, if we cannot now end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Khrushchev was stunned. Pardon me, I get emotional when I deliver this part of my presentation. They had been discussing ways to make a test ban treaty work since January of '63, Kennedy and Khrushchev. And yet, in spite of those discussions, Khrushchev was stunned. He declared it the greatest American speech since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. The Soviet government stopped jamming the Voice of America broadcasts to allow the peace speech to be played in full on the air. The Soviet government also printed the entire text uncensored. This is important. In both Pravda and Izvestia. There were parts of the speech that were very unflattering to communism. And Kennedy talked about it being repugnant and against all of our basic values. They left that in the speech when they published it. They didn't delete that from the Voice of America broadcast or from the Russian translation in the newspaper. JFK and Khrushchev, as I say, had been discussing ways to make a test ban treaty achievable. So they were almost there. Khrushchev was still opposing a lot of our inspection provisions that we wanted to do on the ground. And he considered them tantamount to spying. And he was not in favor of banning all tests. He didn't want to ban underground tests, just in the atmosphere, the space, and outer space, and in the water. So they realized that at this point, Kennedy realized that, okay, this is the way I'm going to get a deal. I'm not going to go for everything. If you go for everything, you often get nothing. I'm going to go for everything that's achievable to stop this nuclear fallout in the atmosphere and reduce world tensions. So that's what they did. They sent negotiators together. The negotiations commenced between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union on July 15th in '63. The intent was to get a limited test ban treaty, to allow underground tests, but to ban them in the atmosphere and outer space and underwater. Khrushchev was actually in attendance when the negotiations began. That was a very good sign. You know, he acted tough and he said, I'm not going to ban underground tests, and you got, you know, too many intrusive inspection requirements, but we can examine the other things. So they did. Kennedy also announced in this speech, in the peace speech, that the U.S. was announcing a complete moratorium on its own testing, which he had recommenced in April '62, providing other states did the same. And of course, other states did the same. Soviets didn't, they stopped. They didn't do any more. We had done over 100 tests since April '62. All of our weaponeers were satisfied. They got to test all their new designs and had figured out even more efficient ways to kill human beings. So they didn't need to do any more. The chief U.S. negotiator was Undersecretary of State Averell Harriman, the old man who had negotiated a neutral solution in Laos for Kennedy. Harriman was a mixed bag. He was against a diplomatic solution in Vietnam. He was against a neutralization of Vietnam the way we had done in Laos. And yet he had done what Kennedy wanted in Laos. And he did what Kennedy wanted with the Test Ban Treaty. And he was trusted because not only had he been the co-chair of the Harriman-Beaverbrook supply mission to the Soviet Union in September of 1941, when they were on the ropes and being defeated by Hitler, he was the co-head of that supply mission for Lend-Lease. But he had become ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II from 1943 through January 1946. So they trusted Harriman. Kennedy remained involved in the negotiations on a daily basis. And the treaty was initialed on July 25th. Kennedy viewed the treaty as a way to slow nuclear proliferation around the world and as a foot in the door, a first step toward future arms control agreements. And certainly, psychologically, it would have been. If he had remained president, and if Khrushchev had remained president, it would have been a foot in the door toward arms control agreements. The achievement was so important to him that he made a major address on national TV the next day. This is one of my favorite slides. Looking fatigued and haunted, JFK spoke to the nation on July 26, 1963, about reaching an agreement with the USSR on a limited nuclear test ban treaty. And he does look fatigued and haunted. You can see it on his face. I speak to you tonight in a spirit of hope. Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. Negotiations were concluded in Moscow on a treaty to ban all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. It is a victory for mankind. This treaty is not the millennium, but it is an important first step, a step toward peace, a step toward reason, a step away from war. And he considered stopping nuclear testing to be a step away from war because it would lower the international temperature and the international tensions, stop the one-upmanship, stop bellicose threats like the Tsar Bomba and our nuclear test in the Pacific, stop those things. This is why he was so concerned. The continued testing and stockpiling of immensely destructive hydrogen bombs threaten the future of human existence. Now, this is the mushroom cloud after our first thermonuclear detonation, Ivy Mike. It's enormous. This is the Castle Bravo test in 1954, 2.5 times more powerful than we planned it to be. That's frightening in and of itself. And the rest of these images are just terrific, and they speak for themselves. I believe this is one of the tests after we resumed testing in April '62. This is horrific also. Between 1945 and 1962, the United States conducted 331 atmospheric nuclear tests. That's a lot of fallout problems. The Soviets conducted an almost identical number. They created a lot of fallout problems. So the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty stimulated this speech. The formal name of the treaty is listed here: Treaty Banning Nuclear Weapons Tests in the Atmosphere, in Outer Space, and Underwater. And this is a profoundly moving address to me today. It was then, it remains. I'm going to let you read it for yourself. I'm not going to do a dramatic reading. We have to keep moving. But you can tell that JFK is speaking with absolute sincerity, speaking from his heart. And of course, the four benefits that he mentioned were reducing world tension and making possible broader areas of agreement, freeing the world from fears and dangers of nuclear fallout. It might slow proliferation, and it could limit the nuclear arms race. So this is my second and final slide on the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty speech. He made two passages toward the end of the speech, which I encourage you to read here, just in case anybody didn't get it, scaring the hell out of the people listening to the speech, telling them how many lives could be lost in the first 60 minutes of a full-scale nuclear exchange. More than 300 million people could die in the first 60 minutes of this war. And no wonder he looked so worried. Four of his own advisors, Paul Nitze, Roswell Gilpatrick, General Tommy Power, and General LeMay, had all reputedly wanted to first strike the USSR during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were sacred cows in the American national security establishment, and they didn't get it. They either viewed nukes as a bigger and better way to do strategic bombing, or they had so demonized and dehumanized the enemy in their own minds, I think this is more likely, that in a time of stress, they didn't care that they had adopted a truly genocidal mentality. They just didn't care. Poll numbers were favorable right after the speech. I'll let you read these on your own. And JFK's ally in this cause, who had worked with him on the issue before the peace speech, Norman Cousins, helped him sell the treaty to the American people. You can read all about Norman Cousins in Jeffrey Sachs's book. He was relaying messages from Khrushchev and from the Pope to Kennedy, and Kennedy was relaying messages back to them through Cousins. And then Cousins, the editor of Saturday Review, helped sell this to the American people, along with magazine articles, speeches, and Kennedy made some speeches too, selling this concept to the American people. Now, McNamara and Gilpatrick spent many days persuading the reluctant service chiefs that the treaty would freeze our superiority in place. And after bludgeoning them into submission, only Max Taylor was allowed to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, not the other chiefs, not Curtis LeMay. Now, Fulbright's Foreign Relations Committee took up the treaty first before the less friendly Senate Armed Services Committee. So LeMay didn't even get to speak until the Armed Services Committee convened. And by the time the two right-wing opponents of the treaty, Edward Teller, our foremost designer of the hydrogen bomb, and Lewis Strauss, former head of the Atomic Energy Commission, who had supported the super, by the time they spoke, they'd already lost the battle. They'd lost the public relations battle already, even though they came out strongly against the treaty. So the Senate ratified the treaty 80-19. JFK signed the instruments of ratification on October 7th. It was his proudest achievement. And he looks very calm, sober, composed, and I must say, proud in this famous photograph from the Kennedy Library. And there's Averell Harriman in the second row on the left of the picture. Second row on the left, looking down at JFK signing the treaty that he engineered in Moscow. Here's a summary of Kennedy's journey from 1961 to 1963 for all 3 years of his journey as president, as it relates to the national security state. This is an extremely important slide. This is the summary of what my presentation is about. John F. Kennedy entered the presidency as a skeptic about the national security establishment. By the end of 1961, mutual distrust defined his relationship with most of the Cold War policymakers after his decisions not to go to war in Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. Mutual distrust. By the end of 1962, his enemies in the national security establishment viewed him as a heretic, following his resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis by diplomacy instead of war. His relationship with most of these sacred cows throughout most of 1962 could be defined as one of mutual contempt. Mutual contempt. I don't think that's an overstatement. So his relationship with the national security state and its sacred cows went from mutual distrust at the end of 61 to mutual contempt throughout most of 62, and certainly that's where it was at the end of the year. In 1963, after he gave the peace speech, after he ensured the successful ratification of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, and after he ordered the withdrawal from Vietnam, his enemies inside the national security state viewed him as an apostate. I encourage you to look up those two words. They're both very charged, descriptive words, but an apostate is even worse than a heretic. I'll tell you what the Inquisition did to people who were heretics and apostates. They burned them at the stake. In 1600, they burned Giordano Bruno alive at the stake. A lot of times they would kill people before they burned them at the stake. They burned him alive. That's because he was an apostate. That's what happened to President Kennedy. His assassination in broad daylight in Dealey Plaza was the equivalent of being burned at the stake in the Middle Ages, as an example to everyone else. JFK was a true profile in courage for not going to war on numerous occasions, even though the majority of his own national security establishment pressured him relentlessly to do so. For JFK, war was the option of last resort. This is the main point I want to make with this presentation. For JFK, war was the option of last resort. For many of his advisors engaged in their holy war against communism, war was the preferred option, the option of first resort. JFK paid for his repeated opposition to them in Dallas, Texas, with his life. And now we begin the retrospective on his life and on what happened to him at the end of 1963. This is the arrival in Dallas. And as Jim Douglas stated in his famous book, the unspeakable reared its ugly head in Dallas, Texas. After two other assassination plots failed in Chicago and Miami earlier that month. If those plots hadn't failed, we never would have heard of Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm sure we would have been hearing the name of some other patsy instead. But those plots failed, so the plot in Dallas had to be carried out. This is Love Field. You can see how many people were interested in seeing and meeting the Kennedys. I want you to look at this man. This is the face of Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman. That's a chilling photograph. He was in charge of the physical security during the Dallas trip. He, along with one other man, Floyd Boring, were the twin assistant special agents in charge of the Secret Service White House detail. And Kellerman had just received a promotion. so that he was then, at this time, co-equal with Floyd Boring. Just take a look at that face. Is he watching the crowd? No. That's what he's supposed to be doing. I remind you that Roy Kellerman is the man who watched the assassination unfold in the rearview mirror on the side of his car door during the assassination. He was in the right front seat of the limousine. He didn't make a move to try to protect the president. He's also the man who began the casket shenanigans. And I don't mean at Bethesda. He's the man that ensured Kennedy's body in the Dallas casket was removed from Parkland Hospital. He ensured that there would be no honest autopsy in the state of Texas. Those were his marching orders that day. And he carried out his orders. And then at Bethesda Naval Hospital, he was the battalion commander on the ground who monitored who was allowed into the morgue and who wasn't, and managed the casket entries, the 3 separate casket entries, kept those audiences apart from each other, and kept the FBI agents out of the morgue. While the president's wounds were being altered. That's Roy Kellerman. There's another picture of the adoring crowd at Love Field. Famous picture of the motorcade. There's Clint Hill on the left running board of the Queen Mary. Some of the crowd in Dallas was 12 people deep on each side. Even though Dallas was called the city of hate, and he was supposedly more unpopular there than anywhere else, we had huge crowds show up to see the president and his wife. This is the infamous Mary Mormon Polaroid photograph taken during the shooting. Mary Mormon always said she heard additional shots after this photograph was taken. This is the immediate aftermath of the shooting. You notice Bill and Gail Newman are on the ground protecting their children. They heard shots come from behind them in the vicinity of the grassy knoll and covered their children. This is a very famous public domain photograph. It's actually from the Kennedy Library of Bill and Gail Newman protecting their children. You can see how few people were at this part of Elm Street. This was a very carefully planned military-style ambush. There were almost no people to the right or left of the limousine when the shooting took place. There's the swearing in on Air Force One on the ground at Love Field. That's Jack Valenti on the left, looking up at the camera. One of Lyndon's Texas sycophants, the man who did his best to stop Oliver Stone's movie from being completed. Went into the full attack mode against the movie JFK. And here's the most infamous of the swearing-in photographs. This is the famous wink photo of Congressman Al Thomas winking at LBJ right after he's sworn in. Air Force One on the ground at Andrews Air Force Base. You can see Jackie and Bobby Kennedy standing in the door of the lift truck. In the bronze Dallas casket, the heavy, ornate ceremonial coffin is being taken from the lift truck into the Navy cardiac ambulance. So Dallas was journey's end for John F. Kennedy. This is the East Room of the White House on Saturday, November 23rd. And then JFK was taken to lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol on Sunday, November 24th. Jackie and the children are following up the steps. That's the Joint Service Casket Team, the Honor Guard, serving as the pallbearers. This is Lyndon Johnson doing a wreath laying inside the rotunda. And JFK's wife and his daughter are saying their farewells to the casket. Jackie's kissing the flag. Carolyn is sneaking her little hand underneath the flag to touch the mahogany casket. On Monday, the president's body went to St. Matthew's Cathedral, and then after that, it went to Arlington National Cemetery. I want you to look who's in the procession that led the casket out of the White House driveway. We've been talking about these men today. Maxwell Taylor on the left, Curtis LeMay himself on the right, with the other Joint Chiefs behind them. I wonder what was going through their minds, especially Taylor and LeMay, who had clashed repeatedly with JFK over policy. I wonder what was going through their minds at this moment. Here's a shot from the Kennedy Library of the Joint Service Casket Team at the funeral at Arlington. You'll notice that two people who wore their uniforms, two foreign heads of state who wore their uniforms to honor the American head of state, were Haile Selassie of Ethiopia and Charles de Gaulle of France. De Gaulle's wearing his World War II uniform, looking profoundly sad. He had advised Kennedy, based on the French bitter experience in French Indochina and Vietnam, not to get involved in a ground war in Vietnam. Kennedy was starting to take his advice in 1963. Earlier, in fact, had started to take his advice by not committing combat troops. Douglas MacArthur told Kennedy not to commit combat troops to a land war in Asia. De Gaulle told him not to do that. And Kennedy refused to commit combat troops and was in fact withdrawing in 1963. So de Gaulle looks profoundly sad. Kennedy was of a different generation, much younger, but they did have that in common. And here de Gaulle and Selassie are saluting Kennedy and the flag. And shortly after this picture was taken, the flag was folded and handed to the widow. This picture is so sad. She's totally bereaved. And as she leaves the casket, who is she walking by? Max Taylor and Curtis LeMay. Right there in the front row. She's walking right past them. The bullets in Dallas left us with a void that we still feel today. A void that only grows with the passage of time. Some would say that the United States government has been a riderless horse since November of 1963. So in this regard, I found blackjack to be a useful symbol, a useful metaphor for this point of view. What president has seriously stood up to the national security establishment since November of '63? I can't think of any. Well, this is the metaphor that just won't go away, 7 Days in May. The book came out in 1962, co-authored by Fletcher Neville and Charles W. Bailey II, and the film was made in 1963 at Kennedy's urging. The film's release was scheduled for late November of '63, the week after the Dallas trip. But it was postponed due to its disturbing content, and I don't believe it was released until about February of 1964. So the word of mouth is that he asked his Hollywood friend, director John Frankenheimer, to make the movie as a warning to the nation that there could be a military coup under the right circumstances in this country, that there was that much disrespect by the military leadership for civilian control. If you listen to the audio commentary on the DVD of 7 Days in May, you'll hear Frankenheimer say that President Kennedy wanted very much for this movie to be made. And in fact, Kennedy did vacate the White House one weekend to allow them to film a riot scene outside the White House and to allow them to go inside and take a lot of interior shots so that the people who build the movie sets could later build accurate sets based on the photographs of the inside of the White House. So they took a lot of interior shots and then constructed their sets later. Now, JFK commented on the 1962 national security bestseller, 7 Days in May, to his friend Paul Fay, the Undersecretary of the Navy. I've mentioned his book before, The Pleasure of His Company. This quote is so profound that I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to remember that this is Kennedy talking before the missile crisis, which in the minds of his detractors would have been another Bay of Pigs, except even worse, where he didn't invade Cuba when he had a chance to. So he's making these remarks before the missile crisis. Quote, "It's possible, it could happen in this country, but the conditions would have to be just right. If, for example, the country had a young president and he had a Bay of Pigs, there would be a certain uneasiness. Maybe the military would do a little criticizing behind his back, but this would be written off as the usual military dissatisfaction with civilian control. Then if there were another Bay of Pigs, the reaction of the country would be, is he too young and inexperienced? The military would almost feel it was their patriotic obligation to stand ready to preserve the integrity of the nation. And God only knows just what segment of democracy they would be defending if they overthrew the elected establishment. Then if there were a third Bay of Pigs, it could happen. But it won't happen on my watch." End quote. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you, it did happen on his watch. Except that instead of a military junta taking over in a bloodless coup, which was the scenario proposed in the book and the film, it was an assassination, backstopped by an absurd cover story based on a dead patsy, by planted evidence, by a fraudulent autopsy, and supported by a gullible and compliant national media who thought it was better that they support the integrity of our institutions rather than raise uncomfortable questions about our society and the national security state. It was go along to get along. If you didn't go along with the national security establishment, especially with the agency, you were frozen out. You didn't get any more interviews or background briefings. They went along to get along. Former Senator Gary Hart wrote this about JFK's death, and this is the finest and most meaningful retrospective I have read anywhere on what happened to President Kennedy. He was writing about Kennedy in his book, The Good Fight. And he was writing about him as a reformer, as a role model, as a reformer. And Hart wrote, it was his success that proved life-threatening. For those seriously drawn to public service and social change, Kennedy's death suggested something deeper and more sinister. It suggested the presence of ominous dark forces just beneath society's veneer. Forces that, if goaded by the threat of institutional change, could rise up and strike down anything or anyone, including an increasingly popular president of the United States, who might threaten the status quo, traditional power structures, ancient political arrangements. The first Kennedy assassination had about it a dark, mystical quality. It seemed a warning against straying too near the permissible boundaries of social change. He seemed too independent of established power structures. Jacqueline Kennedy spoke eloquently to Anastas Mikoyan, the deputy premier of the USSR, in the White House reception line prior to JFK's funeral on November 25th. This was recalled vividly by Mikoyan's Soviet interpreter, a very accomplished man named Viktor Sukhadrev. He had also been the interpreter at the Vienna summit between Kennedy and Khrushchev. So he was good at listening to the words of others and translating them precisely with the proper nuance. So he was interviewed in 2003, and he appears in the documentary JFK, A Presidency Revealed, which was an A&E product, Arts and Entertainment Network. And she said, he recalled this with tears in his eyes. She said to the deputy premier of the USSR, quote, Mr. Mikoyan, thank you for coming, and would you tell Mr. Khrushchev for me that my husband and Mr. Khrushchev could have brought peace to this world by working together. Now Mr. Khrushchev will have to do it alone. End quote. That's very profound. Very profound. It speaks volumes. There was no one else in the U.S. national security establishment interested in pursuing world peace with Khrushchev. Jack Kennedy was dead. Ted Sorensen, JFK's speechwriter, said this about why JFK ran for the presidency in 1960. Quote, I think that the principal reason Kennedy ran for the presidency was he thought the Eisenhower Dulles policy of massive retaliation and all of that was heading the country toward nuclear war. He felt the policy of massive retaliation, in which we supposedly kept the peace by saying that if you step 1 foot over the line in West Berlin or somewhere else, we will respond by annihilating you with nuclear weapons. He felt that was mad. He also felt it was a policy that had no credibility and would not prevent Soviet pressures or incursions in one place or another, end quote. Ted Sorensen knew Kennedy's mind better than anyone. He wasn't a part of his close social circle, but he knew his mind better than anyone else, and his ideals and his motivations. Robert McNamara said this about President Kennedy in 2003 in 2 different video interviews. Now, in the documentary Fog of War, he said this, quote, President Kennedy believed a primary responsibility of a president, indeed the primary responsibility of a president, is to keep the nation out of war, if at all possible, end quote. And in the other 2003 documentary, A Presidency Revealed, McNamara said this with tears in his eyes, quote, He was not a perfect human being. Who among us is? He made mistakes in his private life and his public life. But had he lived, the world would be a different world today, and it would be a very, very much better world. I'm going to make this very clear. President Kennedy was loved by Secretary McNamara. McNamara loved President Kennedy and was very loyal to him up until the moment of his death. Some days were good days, like September 12th, 1962 in Houston, where JFK gave an inspirational address on the importance of the space program. Another rhetorical masterpiece, just like the inaugural address and just like the peace speech. And previously, on February 23rd, 1962, when President Kennedy awarded the NASA Distinguished Service Medal to astronaut John Glenn after he became the first American to orbit the Earth, that was also a good day, a very good day. Look at how happy both men are, especially President Kennedy on the right. Just delighted to be there and to be with John Glenn. And John Glenn loved and respected him very much. He was the inspiration that caused John Glenn to enter politics. So here they are that day, examining John Glenn's Mercury space capsule, just 3 days after his trip around the Earth, 3 orbits around the Earth. I can just hear Kennedy saying to him, "It's crowded in there. How did you fit in there?" Crowded. It was very crowded. Another good day was June 26th, 1963 in West Berlin, where President Kennedy celebrated NATO's defense of Western access rights to the city. All 3 Berlin images here are also public domain. Just look at this. Look at this crowd. President Kennedy is in the lower left of the picture, standing at the rostrum. Look at all those people. The speech is covered quite well in the documentary JFK, A Presidency Revealed. They talk about the reaction of the Germans to his speech and how many Germans were present, how many people were there. Here's another photo of it. It's just truly remarkable. It was this visit about which Kennedy said, "We'll never have another day like this. I'll never have another day like this." And that was certainly true. But other days were not so good. They were characterized by incessant pressure to commit American combat troops to invade Cuba and to intervene militarily in Laos in South Vietnam. They were characterized by deceit and lies designed to manipulate him to commit the U.S. military in 1961 to bail out a doomed exile invasion of Cuba based upon a big lie. And a continuous stream of lies in 1962 about the supposed success of the South Vietnamese war effort in its civil war with North Vietnam, so that JFK would not withdraw the American advisors. And they were characterized by unrelenting suggestions to use nuclear weapons against various nations in the communist bloc. These suggestions were proposed many times over Laos in 1961, throughout the Berlin crisis in 61 and 62, and they were proposed against the Soviet Union in 61, 62, and 63. In 61 and 63, in the 2 PSYOP briefings, which both recommended American first strikes on the Soviet Union, and in 1962, some of his closest advisors wanted to first strike the Soviets. Roswell Gilpatrick, Paul Nitze, certainly Tommy Power, almost certainly LeMay. Since LeMay wanted to do it in the 1950s, I'm sure he wanted to do it in 1962, because LeMay considered Cuba a sideshow. And if he considered Cuba a sideshow, then you know what was the main event for him. It was nuking the Soviet Union. This slide summarizes the content of my entire presentation. Disrespect, insubordination, and contempt for President Kennedy characterized the attitude of the Joint Chiefs in 1961 and 1962. For them, war was always the first option. But for President Kennedy, it was the option of last resort. By the end of 1962, I believe JFK's fate was sealed, and the clock was ticking on his life. This photo and the next one are truly instructive. A stern and profoundly unhappy JCS Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer is relieved of his duties by General Maxwell Taylor on October 1st, 1962 in this ceremony. President Kennedy reassigned Lemnitzer to head NATO's military forces in Europe as SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Now, I want to make this point. Just look at Lemnitzer's face. He's furious. He's extremely angry that Kennedy's pinning a medal on his uniform. Like, what right do you have to pin a medal on me? Receiving a medal from the president, his nemesis, did not assuage the injury Lemnitzer felt after nearly 2 years of conflict. Look at him in this photograph. The distrust and dislike between Kennedy and Lemnitzer is evident in this photograph, taken at the same ceremony on October 1st, 1962. Kennedy's looking a little bit down his nose at Lemnitzer with skepticism at the very least, if not disapproval. Lemnitzer just looks totally belligerent. I think I see hatred on his face. And look behind Lemnitzer. Look at Maxwell Taylor. He's in the catbird seat. He's got a smug look on his face. He's very happy. He's smiling. I'm exactly where I want to be. I got what I wanted for the last 2 years. I'm now the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This is the day he became chairman, right before the missile crisis. And on the right of the photograph is Roswell Gilpatrick, the man who gave the speech on October 21st, 1961, saying, yeah, there's a missile gap and a bomber gap, but it favors the United States, so you better not mess with us. The man who also wanted to first strike the Soviet Union during the missile crisis. That's Roswell Gilpatrick, Deputy Secretary of Defense. This photograph has got a lot of history in it. It says a lot about relationships. There's a famous quote from an Englishman named John Harrington. I'm sure some of you have heard it before. Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if it prosper, none dare call it treason. That's worth reading again. Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if it prosper, none dare call it treason. I put this famous quote above the photographs of these two men for a specific reason. These had to be the two most embittered and disappointed men among the military surrounding Kennedy, even more so than Curtis LeMay, probably, at least as much as Curtis LeMay, maybe more so. Some JFK-JCS relationships were more difficult than others, and they only got worse with the passage of time. Thank God the Air Force took these photos. There's a famous Shakespeare quote, "One may smile and be a villain." That's from Hamlet. possible roles of these two individuals in the coup are worthy of further study. You know who that is on the left. I'll leave it for you to find out who that is on the right. Research is being done on these two individuals by someone I know. An embittered Allen Dulles said after Kennedy's death, "That little Kennedy, he thought he was a god." The CIA's head of counterintelligence, James Angleton, at left, and covert operator William Harvey at right, both had important roles in the joint military CIA coup d'etat. You want to learn more about this? If you want to learn more, I recommend you read John Newman's Oswald and the CIA, the Skyhorse edition, with a new epilogue added to it. So I believe that was published in 2008 by Skyhorse with the new epilogue. Read the new epilogue. Read what John Newman says about James Angleton, setting Oswald up following the Mexico City visit by squirreling away certain documents and reports so that they wouldn't become known of by others until the day of the assassination, creating a panic and a cover-up in Washington. And of course, William Harvey was the head of Task Force W. He knew all about the mafia CIA plots to kill Castro, and in fact, he took them over. He took them over even after the CIA lied to Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and said they had been terminated. He took over those plots. He had an extreme animus for the Kennedy brothers and especially for Robert Kennedy. He was on the Mongoose Committee along with Lansdale. Harvey didn't get along with anybody. Standing against their encouragement of clandestine, conventional, and nuclear warfare across the globe was the sober voice of reason, a dedicated humanist who placed human welfare above ideology. This is the shining example that I think President Kennedy leaves with us. He did place human welfare above ideology. He didn't demonize our adversaries. He tried to get Americans to see them as human beings. And to think of them as human beings and to put ourselves in their shoes. By 1963, certainly President Kennedy was a determined and skilled adversary of the prevalent attitudes, the Cold War attitudes, in the Pentagon leadership, in the military leadership all over the world, and by the hawks in the State Department and at CIA. He was a determined man with a purpose and was moving very quickly in 1963 to end the Cold War. And I'm sure that the cabal was determined that he could not live, because if he had had a second term, he would have implemented many of the changes that he desired. He would have implemented some kind of arms control agreement. The first arms control agreement would have been signed of some kind. He would have visited Moscow. He told one of his friends he would have visited Moscow to sign that kind of a treaty. And the rapprochement with Castro probably would have been effectuated. One more slide. As Kennedy said, the United States is the keystone in the arch of freedom. He took our Cold War responsibilities and our nature responsibilities seriously, but for him, war was the option of last resort, not first resort, and that's what got him killed. The people that killed JFK were extremely frustrated after the stalemate in Korea. They all came out of the World War II environment where we had total victory, unconditional surrender of the enemy, which is unusual, by the way, in wars. And they wanted another such victory in the Cold War. They wanted unconditional surrender of the enemy, rollback of the enemy, and they did not want another stalemate like Korea. That was completely unsatisfactory to them. He would not give them the proxy war they wanted with communism in Cuba or in Southeast Asia. He would not give them the nuclear war that many of them wanted, to his everlasting credit as a human being. So I want to thank several people. It's my thank you slide. David Mantik, Gaten Fonzie, Jeremy Gunn, John Newman, Jacob Hornberger, my two friends in Los Angeles, Sidney Wilkinson and Tom Whitehead, Peter Janney, who led me to Dijo Brugioni of the formerly CIA photo analyst at INPIC, Peter Janney, who's now a good friend and who led me to Dino and allowed me to do a seminal video interview of Dino in 2011, and Beverly Sadowski. And I want to thank John F. Kennedy, who inspired me to serve in the United States Navy, to honor public service, and to value truth above all things. Because so did Kennedy. I want to thank Jacob Hornberger and the Future of Freedom Foundation very much for giving me this extended opportunity to make this presentation. It's the most important thing I've ever done in this regard, most important presentation I've ever made. So thank you very much to them, and thank you all for your attention.